Hi, everyone. Welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kan, founder of Being Patient. Today, we're going to talk about caregiving, not only from the caregiver's perspective, but from a physician's perspective. Joining me is Dr. Arthur Kleinman. He is the author of a book called The Soul of Care, and articulately put, it's the moral education of a husband and a doctor. Dr. Kleinman's late wife, Joan, was diagnosed with a rare type of early onset Alzheimer's, and he writes about caregiving for Joan from both the perspective of a caregiver and as a physician. Dr. Kleinman, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
I should also say you are a professor of psychiatry and also of medical anthropology at Harvard Med School, completely qualified to speak from a physician's point of view. But I love that you've personalized caregiving in this from both perspectives. Can you tell us first why that was so important from your own experience to really write about your own personal experience with Joan?
Well, the reason I wanted to write about it was that the personal experience of being a family carer altered in a major way my understanding of what caregiving was about, which came as a shock to me because I had spent 5 decades of my life studying care and as in research and doing care as a practicing psychiatrist. And so it was a surprise to me that all the things I learned by just simply being a family carer. It was as if a veil of ignorance was taken off my eyes. And I think the reason for that is that physicians and nurses structure the caregiving experience in terms of their relationship to patients and families. What they leave out is all the time that families are taking care of somebody, in which the world of the patient and the family are radically different than the world in a clinic or in a hospital. And that family setting, not just family setting, but broadly friendship setting as well, is just so very different. And it's not just that it's a home with all the things we associate with the home, but it has with it all the relationships that are what defines our life, really. Our love relationships to our spouses, parents, children, our friendship relationships to neighbors, community members, etc., and all the other relationships we have that define what you do in your life. Going to the neighborhood stores, the bank, the restaurants, and the like. That's the way we live our lives. Well, when someone has Alzheimer's disease or another kind of dementia, that changes all those things, not just for the person who's affected, but for the family carers also.
Is you, in your opinion, I mean, I know within my family's own experience with my mom's care team, it's really, we find the social worker who we need to talk to the most. And that's primarily because we're talking about how interpersonal relationships change. So how we need to educate ourselves about a different type of conversation, a different language to use when talking to my mom, in order to not make her feel badly, not talking over her, things like that. Are you talking about practical things as well, like that example where we really need to change the way that we relate to our loved ones?
I'm talking about the most practical things on earth, like bathing someone, feeding them, helping them to walk around. This is what caregiving in the context of frail elderly or elderly with dementia is about. Also, I mean, the other part about this is that I think you're absolutely right about social workers, extremely important. Important in terms of negotiating health insurance systems and the healthcare system generally, but also with very practical advice about how to do things. However, in my particular case, the most important person for me was not a social worker, but a home health aide. So in the United States, we don't have the exact numbers, but there's somewhere between 2 and 4 million home health aides in America. These could be as formally trained as a nurse, nursing assistant who takes additional work working with a family, or someone who has no training whatsoever and simply fills the role of helping as an aide. In the Chinese setting, this is often called a baomu. A baomu is a distant relative from a rural area or another person from a poor area who comes to clean, help cook in the family, and also take care of an elderly person. So that person for me was absolutely critical. And she came out of one of the two major sources of home health aides in Boston, which are either coming from the immigrant community of Haitians or from the established Irish community, in which there is a tradition of family members who provide professional care of a home health aide type. We were
Now,
enormously fortunate in this regard, let me just say, and that I had to point to your viewers to one thing that really mattered with care of a dependent elderly person. It was a home health aide.
well, because they really truly become integrated into your family in a sense if they're providing in-home
Right.
care. So, I mean, obviously, you've had a lot of medical training and have a long list of credentials. Were you at all? I mean, it sounds like you weren't prepared for this from the physician's point of view. I know that you.
From the point of view of a husband. So I came out of I'm 78 years of age. This started when my wife was about 59 and I was 58, and went for a decade, a little over a decade. And I was totally unprepared. So as I was totally unwoke, unliberated, came out of your classical American, or for that matter, East Asian uh, uh, family setting in which my wife practically took care of everything in our lives. And I brought the money and did the work, but we were also collaborators in research, which made it somewhat different. But my wife was astonishing in what she did. And in the first year in which she could no longer do these things, she said to me, if I knew how competent you were in doing these things, I never would have left you off earlier on. So I was totally unprepared.
Did
Yeah.
Did you have the opportunity to talk when she was first diagnosed, which was, in her late 50s? Did you have the opportunity to discuss with her what a later stage of this disease may look like with you caring for her? And did she have any opinions or input to add?
Well, she was ridden with guilt that what should have been our golden years were now going to be something different, and that I would have to bear the burden. But she, the first night that after the diagnosis was made, my wife was a wonderful, she was sort of an Audrey Hepburn look-alike with a fantastic personality, but with steel in her. She was very strong. And she said in a unemotional, very direct way the following. She said, I will not linger with this disease. You will find a way of helping me end it so that I do not lose respect or dignity. And
Wow.
of course, I was not about to help her end her life at any point. I just couldn't conceive of that. But right from the beginning, that was her concern, that she would lose her dignity. And that was, she was an enormously dignified person. How we then later coped with the various developments changed, as it does with dementia, as you go through the course of dementia. So early in dementia, we're really talking about mild, relatively mild cognitive changes. They're going to interfere with your ability to use the computer, to continue to do your work if you're an academic or an intellectual and have to read and write for your work. But they're going to free you up in other areas. They're not affecting your body yet. They're not, your everything else about you, emotionally, personally, is there. Okay. However, over time, that cognitive decline becomes very severe. And there was a time with my wife when she was a China scholar and loved Chinese painting and was herself a good calligrapher and painter. She couldn't do that anymore. She couldn't even, because it was an unusual form of Alzheimer's that made her both blind and having dementia. She could no longer see the Chinese paintings that she had collected over a lifetime that meant a great deal to her. She couldn't make sense of the radio or the television. Her world narrowed very substantially. And with it narrowing, there also were physical limitations. So increasingly, she couldn't do things like handle a knife and fork, or a glass of water, or dress herself, or bathe herself. So I took on all those responsibilities. And for me, actually, it was a redemptive time because, as I said, I had been so unliberated and had been cared for 36 years by my wife. And for the next 10 years, I reciprocated. So I felt this was a gift exchange, a reciprocation. And I felt quite good about the early years, that I was doing something that I should have been doing earlier, I should have done earlier, and also that it was within my competence. I felt I could do all these things. But then increasingly, things occurred that I felt incompetent to handle, because Alzheimer's becomes not just a complete cognitive disaster, but becomes a disaster, a catastrophe for personality and for emotion. And as my wife became, she always had been the calmest of persons, as she became more intensively distraught and frustrated and angry, and her personality changed with it, I didn't feel that I had all the skills to manage this. Even though I'm a professional psychiatrist and anthropologist, like a psychiatrist, deals with people, I just felt that I wasn't prepared. And this took, I felt, a moral shift, a shift in what I needed to focus on. And so I'd been so in love with my wife. The relationship was the strongest you could imagine. But I had never really thought about the fact that what happens with your presence when the other person begins to sort of be distracted by the illness, lose attention, over time begin not to be the person you had been married to before. And that takes quite a leap forward in keeping yourself oriented and loving, because the person who you loved and were oriented to is frankly no longer there. You're dealing with somebody else in this setting. And I think my wife came to recognize that at a certain point, and we talked about it, but even that did not help. I just felt over time it became unbearable and even unendurable. And here's where I want to just say something to your viewers, that I've been very successful in my life in just about anything you can name. I never really was defeated. But for the first time, I really had the sense that I couldn't do this. I kept going because that was sort of my way of coping. Just keep going, keep doing it, ritualize it, make it a habit, just keep doing it. But over time, I needed help. And it was my children who recognized this. And it was the home health aide who picked up. So she came in around 4 or 5 years into Joan's illness. And she worked 5 days a week, 9 to 5. And I worked on the weekends and then during the week, 5 to 9, 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. And we really had a sense of collaborating in this care. And that gave me both respite time where I could get away and work and keep earning a living, and also feel that there was another side of me, beside the side that was so frustrated in the caregiving. And also she was just terrific with Joan. They developed like many situations of patients with dementia and a home health aide who's a new person who comes into their life. At first, there is strong resistance.
Yes.
Accepting that person. And it takes weeks to months before it clicks. When it clicks, it's fantastic because then that family member of yours who's struggling so heroically with an illness, he's got another person to relate to. And
yeah.
That opens up all kinds of possibilities.
Well,
so,
and I love what you're saying, because a lot of this is admitting that you can't do it alone. You're going to need help. And, you know, but we hear a lot from people who they can't afford it. I mean, the healthcare system is one such that they've had to spend down their savings and they've had to take care of their loved one, and they can't afford the help. But I take what you're saying with like great value, because I do think successful caregiving means staying yourself as a person and having your career or whatever your interests are, being able to continue those so that you can really give the best type of care to the person. And is that really what you mean? It's like you need to allow yourself to exist as you existed, as well as a caregiver for your loved one.
Yes, and I think that is associated with a bunch of tough choices. There comes a time when you have to face the reality that you can no longer take care of this person at home. That happens to everyone who has a family member with dementia who gets to the last stage of dementia. So for me, since it was early onset Alzheimer's is different from Alzheimer's coming in later in life, because early onset tends to have a quicker period of time until death, and at the very end, very quickly produces paralysis and the very end stage, almost like an end stage to cancer or heart disease. And so at that stage, I found that I could no longer lift my wife, do all the nursing that was needed, and I had to make the decision for her to enter a nursing home. That was an extraordinarily difficult decision to make. And after I made it, a number of nursing homes, I visited with my children just to get a sense, about 22, 23 nursing homes.
Wow.
In the Boston area, just to get a sense of, what was available to us. And finally, we found a great one I went to. But a couple of the directors of nursing homes we went to said that they said to me, you've taken care of Joan too long at home. That had she come earlier, she would have been more adapted to and found it easier to be in the nursing home. That was interesting. I'd never thought about that before. I'm glad I took care of her as long as I did, but it was, again, eye-opening to me that it's important to think right as you go through this, is this the best setting that you're in for someone? And let me just reflect on another way. My late mother died a few years after Joan, and she helped me take care of Joan. She was 102.
Wow.
She lived on her own.
Dementia?
Yeah, she was totally, she lived, when she was 102, she was advising me on who to vote for and local elections. But
Amazing.
lived on her own independently in near Harvard Law School for until she was 99. And then Joan had recently died. And I thought, well, why don't you come live with me? You can't take care of yourself any longer. Come live with me. She was hesitant to do it, but she came. But after a few months, she said, I don't think this is good for me because you're gone during the day. I'm away from people my own age and friends. I think I might do better in an assisted living setting. So she was still 99 at that point. And I was resistant to this idea because I loved my mother. I wanted to give her the best of care. But actually, when she went into assisted living, she changed entirely. And I realized that she was depressed when she was with me. And she flowered in the assisted living. So I've come to the point of view, and I make this point in The Soul of Care, my new book, that everyone has got to evaluate their loved one in terms of, is this the best place to give and receive the care? And I could understand a decision being made much earlier in the course of care than I made it, that a cognitive care unit, a nursing home, or assisted living would be a better place to be, a place that provided more stimulus or support, and that could also make the transition to the very end stage of Alzheimer's easier. I've come to understand that better, that all of this, that there's no one size fits all, that this is all oriented around one particular person and how they've developed, how their family is, and how they mesh together. And I think that was extremely important to recognize. And I found the decision for her to go into a nursing home the most excruciating decision I had ever made. I felt like a total, complete failure.
We're getting a lot of comments around this point because I think this is a really valuable one. I think people feel guilty no matter what. And, like you were saying, maybe I didn't put her in early enough, or I really want to have her at home or him at home, but I can't. We have a one woman who's just commented, I wish I could look after my mom at home, but the care system as it is wouldn't let me continue to work and look after her at the same time. Right. So this is a point a lot of people, I think most people struggle with. Yeah. My question to you is, what was the turning point for you? What made you say, I just can't do it anymore?
Okay, so the book is extremely personal, and I give the details of this. For me, there was a single event that produced this decision as its outcome, and that event was July 4th, 2010. My wife was in very, very bad straits at that point, but was still at home with me. And I thought we should, it was July 4th, I thought we should go away, and that we have a summer house in Maine that we hadn't visited at all that year, and that she had loved at least in the past. And I thought, why don't we go up there? So I asked her, she understood what I was asking and agreed with a big smile, even laughter. And we drove 3.5 hours up to our house in Maine. We got up there, and I had to open it up, get things ready, put hamburgers on the grill. And just as we were sitting down to eat, my wife got extremely agitated. And I could tell that this was going to be a disaster if we stayed there. So I packed everything up, calmed her down as much as I could, got into the car, and she started fiddling with the door on her side. And so I had to hold both of her hands in her lap as I drove with my left hand the 3.5 hours back. So just picture this day, 3.5 hours up, getting the house ready and everything, 3.5 hours back. By the time we got back, my wife was delirious. She didn't know where she was or who I was. She was screaming and yelling. And when we got into the house, she was throwing things. And she fell down to the floor, just lay on the floor in a period of agitated delirium, just pounding the floor, etc. And I just fell to the floor myself and just sat there kind of hopeless and helpless. And then she fell asleep. And I called a former student of mine who brought over a geriatric psychiatrist who was an expert on this particular stage of Alzheimer's. And by that time, Joan had gotten awakened again, was more reasonable and cogent. But after interviewing her, this colleague of mine said to me, took me aside and said, you cannot take care of her any longer. You've done as much as you could. She requires now professional services of an intense kind. And so she went into a nursing home, and in that nursing home, so delirious was she and so agitated that I provided in the nursing home round-the-clock nursing for more than a month, maybe 6 weeks. And then she was able to be cared for by the nursing assistants in the nursing home, the aides working in the nursing home. But that period of time, it was a terrible period of time. And when we got to a mental health facility on the way to the nursing home, I remember feeling so desperate about leaving her there that I thought about escaping with her, that is, taking her away, even after they had accepted her and she'd been admitted. I thought, I just can't leave her here. And they wouldn't let me stay. That was the other thing. And my this home health aide, who had joined us at that point, again, said, well, look, they'll let me stay for a couple of hours. This was about 11 o'clock at night. And I went home and just broke down entirely, called my kids, explained to them what had happened, and realized I sort of had come to the end of my abilities. Now, I think that if you're a highly successful person who's always won no matter what, that's as bad a time as you can ever have. And it teaches you the lesson, it didn't have to be that bad. And that's why I think that the input I had from several nursing home directors that it would have been better for you and particularly for her if you had gotten her here earlier, made me think that how you do that, how you make that decision is critical, and you need all the assistance you can get when you make it.
And one thing that really I value of what you're saying is the importance of being honest with yourself. You know, hypothetically, we would all love to say to our loved ones, we're going to take care of you till the very end. But actually, that may not be possible. And, you know, what I really value and what I'm really taking away from this is that ability to pause and say, I need to be honest with myself, what's realistic and what's not. And the other thing that you're pointing out, which I think is so valuable too, is the need to depend on other people at times when you need help. I think a lot of people deny this. I can see it within my own family. My father is a physician as well, but his insistence, he can do it. But there comes a point where you just really can't do it by yourself.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. And my two kids came to that recognition before I did, and they gave me an enormous amount of support, as did my mother, who was in her 90s when she was giving me this help. So I benefited from lots of support. And I point this out in the book. It wasn't just my family. It was neighbors, friends. Of course, some friends drop out at this point, they can't handle it. But other friends come in. Neighbors, my neighbors did generally a very, very nice job of supporting us. Even the local community in which there's a bank, a Whole Foods, there was a grocery store, etc. They had so much contact with Joan over the decades that they could be really supportive even when she was agitated, and they normalized things. They gave her a remarkable personal assistance. I felt we almost like we had a community team working on this, and that was all spontaneous. Well, obviously, that reflected what kind of person she was, that she had produced a support system around her that wanted really to help in every way that they could. Not everyone's going to be like that. But I wanted to point out that these other sides of things are very important. And this makes me think of the question about how do you rearrange your life in the context of a serious cognitive disturbance of dementia. Looking backward at the beginning, Joan and I, for about, I don't know, 6 months to a year, began to sort of not go out and to
isolate yourselves.
Yeah, to isolate ourselves. And then slowly we recognized this, and we realized that there were many friends who had no problem with Joan's Alzheimer's, and we were very happy with them. And so we started to go out again more and more like we had when things were normal. But there came a time when, and this I go through in considerable detail in the book, when you've got to make decisions about what can you and can't you do.
Yeah.
So
I want to actually go a little bit more into that early. We're getting a question from an audience member who's asking, why is it always so hard to diagnose early onset Alzheimer's? Now, that point is important in the context of care because we hear stories of people not getting a diagnosis for years. So you're kind of living in this no man's land, which does make care quite difficult in a sense. So tell us a little bit. I mean, you mentioned, Joan, a rare type of early onset. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's about 5% of Alzheimer's starts in the occipital lobes of the brain, where you interpret images, and so people have visual problems. Let me look at it this way. First of all, let's be honest, all your listeners, you and me. I'm going to tell you this now as someone who's both a professor at Harvard University and as someone who reads the literature assiduously on dementia, okay? We don't know fully what Alzheimer's is. It probably is several disorders, okay? Secondly, we do not understand the cause of Alzheimer's. Next, we have no treatment for Alzheimer's. Okay? So it's in that extraordinarily difficult situation. This is almost like tuberculosis in the 19th century. Okay? That's where we are in terms of our understanding of dementia. We have very limited understanding of it. Our major hypothesis relating to beta amyloid may very well be wrong in this area. And so we're literally changing at this moment our understanding of what is the biology of this problem. And in that context, it's very hard to make a diagnosis. So at first, with my wife, her first symptoms were not cognitive symptoms, they were visual symptoms of impaired vision. And we went to see, because I spent my whole career at Harvard, this is my 43rd year as a professor with all kinds of contacts in medicine. We saw lots of ophthalmologists, neuro-ophthalmologists. None of them could make any sense of this. Finally, after I would say half a year or longer of not being sure what the problem was, a neurological colleague of mine, a neurologist, one of our great neurologists, who is known as an outstanding diagnostician, looked at her most recent MRIs and CT scans, and then the most distant ones, and diagnosed atrophy of her cortical atrophy. Cortex was thinning. That was such an early diagnosis because the radiologists had missed that. So this was made by a neurologist doing a better job than the radiologists, than the neuroradiologists in reading this. These neurologists were my friends and colleagues. They went out of their way to make this diagnosis, and still it was a very tough one, difficult one for them to make. But I want to make a different point, because I think that what people have to realize is that neurology as a field has a problem. It's a field that takes care of the people with neurodegenerative disorders, with stroke, with dementia, but it's oriented almost entirely to diagnosis, has relatively few treatments compared to, say, infectious diseases or cardiology or cancer care, has relatively few treatments, and it is unprepared, by and large, to deal with the question which should be the main question that everyone who gets the diagnosis should be asking. What is it like to live with this disease? What should we prepare ourselves for? What is it like? Would you believe that the neurologists that I saw, some of the world's best, not a single one told me about a home health aide or about the fact that I should prepare the house for someone who's going to be both blind and having dementia, or anything else having to do with the aftercare. And indeed, in the care of a neurologist specializing in this disorder, Alzheimer's, my wife and I got the feeling that she was simply being observed every 6 months without any useful input. Where did the useful input come from? It came from our primary care doctors. It came from physical therapists. It came from a social worker. It came from our home health aide. It came from family members. So this is what people need to prepare themselves for. When this diagnosis is made, you need all the help you can possibly muster to look ahead and plan ahead. And that is not going to be, by and large, forthcoming, because the very field that specializes in this problem is unprepared to handle it.
So, Dr. Kleinman, I'd like to end on, I love how you've really written about this experience as a very rewarding experience. You know, we always frame caregiving as, wow, it's so taxing, it's in the negative limelight, but what you've said is it was rewarding. So tell us what you meant, and what were the rewards and what you learned from that as a human being, what you learned.
Yeah, so I think reward is too economically oriented idea. This is a disorder that takes away your energy, is very expensive, draws on your finances, and all the strengths that you have. Nonetheless, for me, it was a redemptive experience, because it was part of the exchange, the gift exchange, in which my wife had given me her love, her attention, her care for 36 years. And for 10 years, I gave her everything I had. And at the end of it, I felt an enormous sense of purpose in my life and benefit. The astonishing thing is, I would never want anyone to go through this experience. But I can tell you that if you have to go through it, and you work at it, and you work at enduring and making this thing a reality, you're going to get something out of it. And we know this research-wise, by the way. We know that families, besides all the stress-related problems, often report that care of of a family member with dementia is an important opportunity to provide the care that your love for someone enables you to do. It is, in that sense, ultimately rewarding. And that's why I use the term a moral education. The soul of care, the moral education of a husband and a doctor, made me a different person. If you had known me beforehand, you would have said, this is a very driven, hardworking, extremely successful academic. And at the end, you would have dropped all those things and said, this is a loving, caring husband. Okay.
So thank you so much, Dr. Arthur Kleinman, for sharing both your personal account and your perspective as a physician. I found this extremely interesting and also applicable to what my own family is going through. So I'm sure you've helped a lot of people. It's articulated very well in his new book called The Soul of Care, available on Amazon. I got my copy from Amazon. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your wisdom with us. If you've missed any part of this interview, please go to beingpatient.com under Brain Talks, where we host talks with experts around Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So please join us and keep abreast with what we're doing on Facebook. Dr. Kleinman, thanks so much again.
Good luck to you. Thank you.